Hello, I'm Paul DeWitt. I'm a member of the Nashville Bar Association Historical Committee, and we have embarked upon a project to interview prominent Nashville attorneys and judges pursuant to our goal of preserving a historical record for future researchers, genealogists, and historians who will have an opportunity to view these videos in the future and find out more about the attorneys and judges who led our city in the past 40, 50, 60 years. Today's date is June 20th, 2017, and I am very honored today to conduct an interview of former Nashville District Attorney Victor S. Torry Johnson III. Torry served our city very well and honorably for about 26 years as district attorney prior to retiring in 2014. And retirement is a misnomer because he is not retired. He has changed careers slightly, is now a law professor at Belmont School of Law. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Torry. Ask him first of all to state your full name and date of birth.
Victor S. Johnson III. I go by Torry, nickname my mother gave me.
Does that come from, is that a diminution of the word Victor? Or
she claimed that it wasn't. Just someone that she knew that she liked the name and to distinguish between myself and my father.
All right. And you were born, I believe, in 1949.
1949 in Chicago.
In Chicago. Your parents moved from Chicago to Nashville in the late 1940s.
Correct.
And I believe that was because your father was president of Aladdin Industries, which had been manufacturing mantle lamps, thermoses, stoves, and other household products for many years. His father had died, I believe, in World War II, and his son, your father, became president upon his death.
Correct.
And just kind of walk us through how he moved the company from Chicago to Nashville
in
the late 40s.
My dad was just like you said, his father died during the war, and he wasn't involved in the war, but was an executive at the time. He died in 1943, and my father was in the Air Force stateside. He was a lawyer and was working on legal issues related to the war effort. And when he got out, he went into the family business and decided that it made a lot of sense to move it to Nashville. He was somewhat familiar with Nashville through my grandfather, who was an early investor in bringing natural gas into Middle Tennessee and up to the East Coast. And so he knew that Aladdin, the business, needed, or it was helpful to have a ready supply of natural gas because we made our own glass at the time, both for thermos bottles and for the kerosene lamps.
And I believe around the same time that Aladdin made its move, the steps were taken by the Tennessee Natural Gas Line Company to provide cheap get natural gas, and then also you had TVA and its Nashville branch, TVS, providing the resources for the production of the glass.
And we were the first major industrial relocation to Nashville after World War II.
And just briefly, I believe the plant was located on Murfreesboro Road, and
correct.
I believe your father's office was maybe initially in a different area.
No, it was later. He was always on Murfreesboro Road, okay. And then when he kind of retired, he moved to Metro Center because at that time Aladdin was involved in developing the Metro Center real estate development.
Right, and you were born in Chicago, but the family moved to Nashville when you were either
6 months
or 6 months
6 months old, I think.
And grew up in Nashville. And just tell us a little bit about where you went to school.
My parents built a house out on Overton Lee Road, again, back when it was pretty rural back then. And I went to Robertson Academy, and then 2 years to MBA, 7th and 8th grade. Robertson Academy, I only went through the 6th grade. And then I went 7th and 8th grade to MBA. And then from there, I went to Deerfield Academy in Deerfield, Massachusetts for 4 years to boarding school. for high school, and then at that point was interested in staying in the East and going to a small liberal arts school.
Of course, you eventually would come back to Nashville when you enrolled in Vanderbilt Law School, and we'll get to that in a little while. But did you all along while you were away at Deerfield and then in college think you would eventually come back to Nashville, or had you thought that far ahead?
I don't know that I don't know how much I thought ahead, except, I mean, certainly I was attracted to places like New York or Boston or even Chicago. But I think at the end, I thought maybe I might live there in one of those larger cities for a while. But I think I always saw myself coming back to Nashville.
Had made friends of
and it was home.
Friend.
You know, it was home, and I can't say that I foresaw what Nashville would become, but.
Do you have any particular memories about Nashville in the 50s and early 60s?
Well, when I look back on it now, I realize it was a pretty quiet, pretty sleepy town.
Yes.
And to see how it's changed over the last 50 years is really remarkable to be so vibrant compared to being pretty quiet back then.
Now, your father, although president of Aladdin, had been trained in the law, and I believe had gotten a law degree from Yale himself. Did he introduce you to lawyers growing up, or encourage you in any way to associate with lawyers, or do you,
or not associate,
or not associate with them?
No, he never. I don't believe he was ever a member of the bar in Nashville or in Tennessee. I mean, he never practiced law. But he did sort of informally serve as general counsel for the business, and certainly he had a great love for the law and being a lawyer. And one of his great, I guess, disappointments was that he always stayed in business and never practiced law. I think that's something that he really wanted to do, perhaps be a judge, whatever. But no, he certainly never encouraged me to go into the law, but he never discouraged me either.
And he would have known many of the prominent attorneys in Nashville. I believe he would have known Judge Miller, who eventually became your boss briefly.
Correct. And then Justice Harbison was in later life became kind of a neighbor of ours, and so a lot of that generation he was certainly very familiar with, and I know enjoyed being with them because of the legal background.
At Deerfield, I believe you developed an interest in photography, and that has more or less become a hobby of yours all through adult life. Can you talk about how did you get interested in that? And
that's a good question. No, I was with some of the kids there that were into photography, and really what got my attention was the actual darkroom, where you took images and then you went in the darkroom and miraculously they appeared after you developed them and printed them, and I thought that was really something. And so I ended up buying a camera, getting involved, and eventually took photographs for the newspaper and the yearbook.
And so if we were somehow able to put our hands on a Deerfield yearbook from circa 1967, the photography in there would be...
You'd see the photographic editor was none other than myself.
And I believe you graduated from Deerfield in 1967.
Right.
And I believe that's 50 years ago.
I just
had my
50th reunion, and actually it was interesting in some of the publications that we got, for that. I saw some of the pictures that I had taken, and I was actually credited.
Is that something? Did you reacquaint yourselves with a lot of old
I did
friends?
Well, and particularly the one person who I literally had not seen in 50 years was the person that probably was most responsible for getting me involved in photography. Now, I wish we and I were talking, and he's probably kept up with it more than I have over the recent years, but he was strongly encouraging me to continue. And
his name is?
Lawrence Stern.
Lawrence Stern.
At the time he was known as Kip, but after he got out of boarding school, he said he switched to Lawrence. So.
Well, it's fantastic that you're able to reconnect with all those guys from school.
Yeah.
By the way, I assume Deerfield was all male at the time.
It was. It's co-ed now, but when I was there all 4 years, it was all boys.
And upon graduating from Deerfield, I believe you were looking around at various small liberal arts colleges in the East and maybe Midwest, and eventually settled upon Hamilton College in New York. Tell us how you came to decide on Hamilton.
Well, I knew my father had gone to Amherst, so I would see Amherst frequently when he would come up to visit me. He'd like to go back and see maybe faculty members or things like that.
And
so
Amherst is a small
college in Massachusetts, not probably 30 minutes from Deerfield, and so we'd go there, and I could tell that I liked the small campus. I liked the small college, and so I started looking at small colleges, and again, the types of Amherst and Williams and Bowdoin and several of those. And then he actually was the one that made me aware of Hamilton, because he had a college roommate that was a kind of a legendary professor there. And so I went to look at it, and immediately walked on the campus and said, this is where I wanted to be, and that's what I did.
Give us an idea. Hamilton, was it all male at the time?
It was all male. I'm trying to think. At the time, we probably had 1,200 students. I think it was all male. The following year, they opened a women's coordinate college literally across the road, and the two were like. They were very opposite in their philosophy and so forth, but eventually they just merged into Hamilton College, which now has about 1,900 students.
Oh, and I believe you were attracted to history, majored in history.
Correct. Yeah.
Did you give any thought to maybe going to graduate school and eventually being maybe a history professor?
No, I really didn't. I mean, I did think about teaching for a while, maybe teaching in boarding school or something like that, because at Deerfield, you ran into a lot of people who were on the faculty. Certainly, many of them had been there for years and years, but others were relatively recent graduates, often of New England schools, either small schools or the larger Ivy League schools that would come and spend 2 or 3 years teaching a particular subject.
I believe one of your favorite professors was Channing Richardson.
Correct. Yeah.
And
he was
international relations. Or
he was my father's a roommate of my father, and certainly took me under his wing sort of when I got there. He and his wife were both very instrumental in kind of the daily life at Hamilton.
And you would say his influence on you was
certainly
less that of a typical professor.
Yeah, I probably had more of a. He was just, and he was a mentor in ways. I mean, he was just he was a fine person and very kind of kind and patient.
Were you by, say, your senior year in college starting to focus on a career in law, or were you still sort of unclear?
I was very much undecided. I think, remember that at the time, this was the height of the Vietnam War, and I think, in thinking back on it, I think when you became a junior and a senior, that was kind of the focus, because you really weren't sure what was going to happen after college necessarily, and. But my senior year, that was the first year, as I recall, the first year of the draft lottery, and I got a high number, which meant it was going to be very unlikely that I would be drafted. And at that point, I had a student deferment.
If I recall correctly, and or my research is correct, up until about 1970. There was sort of a 2-tier or 3-tier system for determining who got drafted and who didn't. And those who didn't tended to be students who had deferments, maybe married people who had deferments, or people who had enrolled in a
But eventually your deferment, once you graduated, it was, and I don't think the deferment really, it didn't automatically transfer to graduate school.
It did not.
So I think you were, that was likely when people would be drafted. But again, then they switched to the lottery, and then it was really all numerically done.
Wasn't that determined by your birth date?
If I recall, the lottery,
they just put all 365 correct. Days of the year in a fishbowl.
My birth date ended up in the high 200s, which meant that it was highly. They'd have to go through all 300. they'd have to go to the 200 plus number. To
what if you'd been number 3 or number 5 instead of in the high?
I was very fatalistic about it. I mean, it didn't. It went well. To be honest, my eyesight was so bad. I would have been far more dangerous to us than to the enemy. So I really never thought about it a great deal because I knew I had pretty bad eyes.
That reminds me, I wore glasses from the age of 6 forward. My eyes, my nearsightedness was that bad. Did you?
10.
10.
I
had to
in
beat
fifth
by
grade.
about 4 years.
I was in 5th grade.
All right. At any rate, to that graduating from Hamilton in the spring of 1971, I believe you enrolled in Vanderbilt Law School. Obviously, it's in Nashville, your hometown. Was that pretty much an automatic decision?
I don't know that it was automatic, but at the time, that was the best option I think I had that I felt, and I think I can't really recall, but I think it was a time when there was a lot of interest in going to law school, and so anyway, but I thought Nashville was I wanted to be back here, and I thought Vanderbilt would be a good place. It's a much better law school now than it was when I went there.
No, you started there in the fall of 71.
Fall of 71.
Tell us what particular professors or courses attracted your interest in law school.
Well, really, about the only thing that attracted my interest was criminal law. I found it fascinating from day one, and I can't say that I found many of the other classes were interesting from an intellectual point of view, but I really couldn't see myself day in and day out dealing with issues of contracts or even torts and real property and estates and trusts were things that just simply didn't interest me.
And probably you were kind of different from many law students who probably would be more focused on civil areas of practice or attracted to contracts and torts.
Certainly.
So your interest in criminal law, would you say that was maybe a little unusual?
I was an outlier when it came to Vanderbilt because in Vanderbilt they really did sort of the minimum, and when it came to criminal law, in the sense that they offered the basic courses. And we had some good professors, but at the same time, it was clear I felt it was clear that Vanderbilt didn't see themselves turning out a lot of criminal either prosecutors or defense attorneys.
Professor Don Hall, I believe, was the professor you had in criminal law.
Don Hall, and I had him when he was relatively new and was just starting out, and he did my recollection of him was that he was a very engaging, energetic kind of a professor, and it was ironic that I don't know when a number of years ago when he finally retired, I was asked to say a few words on his behalf at the retirement dinner, and one of the things I said was how interesting. When I started, he was just a young professor. You didn't know would he stay at Vanderbilt or not. And here I was, however many years later, and he was a legend. He was somebody that had supplanted the previous legends.
Well, I suspect that he eventually became a legend, but probably in the early 70s, you were one of the few students who he had a major influence on.
No, that's true. I don't think he saw a lot of people going into criminal law.
But you chose that, and pretty much from the first year, between your first and second year of law school, you had a chance to further your pursuit of criminal law by clerkship for then District Attorney Tom Shriver.
Correct.
How did that come about?
Well, after your first year in law school, everybody's encouraged to get a job in the legal profession somehow, and obviously a lot of my classmates had wanted to get in with a civil firm or something downtown. I really wasn't too thrilled about that. I talked to my dad, and he had said, well, the Shriver family is someone we've known for years. Maybe General Shriver could use you. And turned out he did have several interns for the summer and took me on.
Just to be clear, Tom Shriver, who was your predecessor, served as district attorney from 1966 to 1987.
Correct.
And his record was broken by you, I believe. We'll get to that later. But
that was my one goal, was to break his record.
Did it seem to you, like it seemed to me and others, that he was like district attorney permanently or forever?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, the idea that anyone else could be district attorney was hard to find.
I still think of him as somebody who was there forever, and not myself.
Well, we should appreciate the standard of honor and integrity he brought to that office. Not that the previous ones didn't, but he had a very high moral character and a sense of fairness to people of all walks of life, all races, creeds, and colors, and that wore off on you and probably others who were.
Well, I think he came at a very important time in that certainly society was changing. He was district attorney right through some of the most revolutionary times when it came to criminal procedure, constitutional rights, criminal constitutional protections, and so forth. And he did all of those things that you just said. And I think that was Nashville in some ways was way ahead of the curve in being progressive when it came to its approach to criminal justice. Because of General Shriver. I mean, he was young when he took office, and then, as you say, was there for 21 years.
Would you say also that he did not let politics intrude upon his prosecutorial decisions? I mean,
right.
which is maybe different from some district attorneys we've seen in other places.
No, I agree. I mean, he was. I mean, certainly, he ran some partisan races, ran for Congress and things like that. But that being said, when it came to hiring people in the office or dealing with cases, there was no sort of political litmus test.
At any rate, that, I guess, summer of '72 and maybe '3, did you clerk those summers for?
I clerked for the DA's office the first summer, '72, I guess, and in '73 I clerked for a firm that was at the time Farris, Warfield, and Samuels. It eventually became Farris, Warfield, and Kanaday, and then became part of Stites and Harbison.
And then you graduated in the spring of '74 from Vanderbilt Law School. Right. Tell us a little about your class, demographically.
Well, I mean, it was
mostly still male, I guess.
Mostly predominantly male. My recollection is we had 6, 7, 8 women, overwhelmingly white, and the large percentage coming from the southeast. And particularly Tennessee, Southern Kentucky, Northern Alabama, Northern Georgia, that type of. It had a very southern flair, but you were starting to see more and more students coming from the Midwest and from the East.
Some of your closest friends were in that class.
Yeah, but really most of the ones, with one or two exceptions, most of the ones that I was the closest to stayed here in Nashville.
And you, upon graduation, were able to secure a clerkship with Federal District Judge William Miller.
Well, he had been district judge, but he was at that time he was on the Sixth Circuit.
Oh, Sixth Circuit in Cincinnati.
And he was in Cincinnati, and he had been on the district judge and had several cases, including he tried the first Jimmy Hoffa case that ended in a hung jury. And I remember, just as an aside, his secretary, he didn't tell me this, his secretary told me that he told her one day when he came out of court, he said, "I can't put my finger on it, but something's not right. Something's going on in this trial and he was prescient about that."
Yes, his intuition was prescient about that. But.
So but in the meantime, he had been elevated to the Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, and so when I was with him, we would spend let's see, every other month we were in Cincinnati.
Okay, so you actually were kind of traveling back and forth from.
We split it between there were two clerks, and we each spent usually I think the sessions were about 3 weeks up there, and we'd each spend about 10 days, a week to 10 days, and split the time.
Were you able to keep up with the criminal case law in that period of time? In other words, were there many criminal cases?
There were a lot. Mostly, not so much. Most of it came through federal habeas corpus, and we did have to review a fair number of federal habeas corpus cases, but not and a handful of actual federal prosecutions.
And but I assume during this period of time you were still interested in practice in Nashville in criminal law.
I'd already spoken with General Shriver and when I graduated, and he had been, fortunately, was very clear. He said, "Well, I'm happy to hire you just when I have an opening." And so I said, "Well, I've got this 1 year clerkship, and then hopefully I can get a job after that." And so it fortunately worked out. About 5 or 6 weeks after my clerkship ended, there was an opening, and I started right after Labor Day in 1975, is my recollection.
Do you remember by any chance what your salary was, or if you could?
We were. It had to be about $10,000, I think, and I was probably happy to get that.
You understood then,
I understood then. That it was,
you imparted that to all your assistants later on. If you want to get rich,
this is not where you're going to get rich.
That's right. But the non-financial rewards are many. And just talk about some of the early days in the DA's office. Like, what was the office like? How many lawyers were there? What kind of cases were you being assigned?
Yeah, well, of course, the one thing is the miraculous thing back then was that I think we only had 10 or 12 assistant district attorneys. We had 3 criminal courts at that time. And not a lot in the way of support staff. It was everybody had to pitch in and do their part. The main thing, though, was that it meant you took on enormous responsibilities that were far beyond what you would typically expect. And so I was, within 18 months. Or within a year of getting there, I was trying major felonies.
Okay.
I don't know how well I was trying them, but I was trying them.
You were probably trying them quite well, because I believe, well, first of all, General Shriver understood that you were a quick study, and second of all, he gave, my recollection from when I worked under him, he gave his assistants a lot of independence to make their own decisions and judgment calls, right. and you could always go to him for advice on whether to zig or to zag. But he did give you, wouldn't you say, a lot of independence?
Absolutely. It was not an office that had a lot of supervision, and that was good news and bad news. Frankly, it just like you described it, we had a lot of independence, a lot of freedom to do that. But at the same time, we probably, in the end, we probably could have used some more direction from time to time.
Now, in those days, as now, the typical early days, you're assigned to General Sessions Court, and that is a tremendous education. And were you assigned to work in General Sessions?
Absolutely.
How many General Sessions courts were there? Judges were there?
I think at that time there were, either 7 or 9. I'm not sure.
And you got to know probably each
of
the
you got
General
all of them, because
Sessions
we were the dockets were quite a bit different than the way they're done today. But yes, we were constantly rotating, and we also rotated down to juvenile court too. Yes. So that the whole rotation was to go through the bond dockets, the jail docket, the juvenile docket. I think that was kind of the pattern.
And pretty quickly, I believe you had your first jury trial, or you undertook a jury trial that did not get to a verdict. Talk about that first jury trial.
Well, that was I can't tell you the first case that I took to a jury. The one that got my attention the most was, we were up there. I was assigned on a temporary basis to try to learn the ropes in Division II, and as I recall, it was John Rogers Sr. and Roger May were permanently assigned to that court, and I was kind of a floater, and they gave me all the lousy cases that they didn't want to handle, and they were in trial, and so I figured that, well, I wouldn't be having to try a case, but Judge Draper said that Judge Cornelius down in Division III could take that case. And
just for the record, we're talking about Judge John Draper, a longtime judge at Division II Criminal Court, and Judge Alan Cornelius, longtime judge.
Correct.
In Division III.
And so my case and witnesses and everybody, we were transferred down the hallway. And so I went, I had a little time to get together and get my case together. And I went downstairs to the office and somehow convinced Sterling Gray to come sit with me, help me, because he was one of the two lawyers that was permanently assigned to Judge Cornelius's court. And of course, he was out of court. Their court was shut. He didn't have he had no responsibility for this case, but he was good enough to say that he would at least come up there and sit with me. And so it was a case. Leon Rubin, who later became a longtime General Sessions judge, Metro councilman, and so forth. He was the defense lawyer, and it was it seemed to me the defendant was a young kid who had been breaking into cars at an apartment complex.
Yes, and so you were all of a sudden sitting his first chair in a felony jury trial,
low grade felony,
low level,
but that's where you take them as you can. And so we tried it, and we got down to defense proof. I managed to get it past directed verdict and got to defense proof, and the defendant got on the stand, and I was getting ready to cross-examine him when I started to get up, and Sterling was sitting there, and he grabbed me by the arm and said, "Let me take him." And Sterling got up there, and without a note or anything, just started cross-examining him. And the defendant didn't help himself. And as soon as the cross-examination was over, Judge Cornelius said, "I'd like to see the lawyers in chambers." And so we all trooped back there. And I remember him looking. He sat there in a chair, and he looked up at Leon, and he said, "Leon, that jury just doesn't believe that boy." And he encouraged us that it might be good to settle the case. And Leon had said he had tried, and that I had made a very fair offer, but that his client hadn't been interested. And he said, but he thought, after hearing what Judge Cornelius had to say, that he could convince his client to take a plea if I would be willing to reoffer it. And at that point, I was happy to do that. I was happy to do that because
you
I
reinstated your
a bird in the hand, and so I said, sure, that's fine. And so it didn't go to verdict. But that's the case, as far as I'm concerned. That's the first case I tried.
That was your first jury trial. Well, you would soon enough try many more, and some very important ones. But I will talk about a couple of those in a minute. But before I forget, could you name some of the more prominent trial lawyers around in Nashville in those days? Were there any lawyers who were kind of regarded as the leaders in the criminal defense bar, or even prosecutors? I think of people like Joe Binkley.
Certainly Joe Binkley Sr. I mean, he had a certain kind of type of case that he was extraordinarily effective in. There were people that did high volume of criminal work, like Dan Garfinkel.
Yes.
Then you had, and certainly Dale Quillen was probably one of the more noticeable and prominent. This was at a period of time when drug cases were over the last, 10 years or so, they became plentiful, and Dale was in the vanguard of representing those. And then Lionel Barrett.
Yes.
Lionel Barrett certainly was. I learned a great deal from Lionel, and another person who was a very effective trial lawyer, who was back in the early days of the public defender's office, was a man by the name of John Kyle. And John, he was often assigned to Judge Leather's court, where I was initially assigned. And John was someone who was a very good advocate, but was not, but would certainly always take you aside and give you some advice. And
would you say he was an influence on you?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, John was certainly older than I was, but he was somebody that I felt did a good job for his clients, but at the same time could do it in a way that wasn't just disagreeable.
anyway, in those days, I guess General Shriver did not have specialties too much within the office. You were expected to one day handle a murder trial, and maybe the week after handle something in juvenile court, and the week after that work a general sessions docket. And perhaps it was felt that it would be on some of the really important cases to develop kind of a team of prosecutors who would work the case with the police from the beginning or in the very early stages all the way through jury trial if necessary. And so the idea of a special prosecution unit developed. Talk about that.
Well, there had been some grant money. There had been some people that had been, in the very early days, focusing on what they call generally lumped into as career criminals, and felt that there was a small group. I mean, this was throughout the country. In every jurisdiction, there would be a small group of people who just simply, whether they were violent or whether they were just simply repetitive, they were people that would commit crime over and over and over again, and that those people needed special attention. You just didn't want them lumped in with every other kind of case and defendant. And so there was some federal grant money available to a number of cities who would to support developing a program with a handful of lawyers who just dealt with these people who were identified as career criminals. You could get an investigator, you could get a couple secretaries and so forth. So we applied for it, and we got a several $100,000 grant, and started targeting people that fit into a description as a career criminal. Many of them were committing crimes like armed robbery over and over again, but also even property crimes, burglars and car thieves, but also certainly a lot of people that were committing other serious felonies.
So about kind of getting in on the ground floor, and having, I guess, police investigators. I think of somebody like Jim Sledge and others from the police department who were put on that unit as sort of a special assignment. You were able to do a lot of the follow-up investigative work that builds stronger cases.
Do it early, because at that point, at that time, it was very difficult for an assistant to get to know much about that case early on, because it was like an assembly line. These cases just sort of moved through the system, and this was a way to pick it up almost from the point of arrest and follow it through.
Talk about a couple of the big cases well, first of all, I believe you, Doug Johnston, maybe Hal McDonough, and Sterling Gray were the four attorneys assigned to that unit. Talk about two or three of the bigger cases y'all successfully prosecuted in that unit. Well,
I mean, really, all of us had fairly major cases that we tried at that time. And I can't remember specifically which cases what cases I tried before and what cases I tried as the in the SPU unit. I mean, we had there were cases. I tried an early case of Robert Courtwright who killed a young child. Martin Walker, who killed his father.
Killed his wife also.
And then also turned out killed his wife. We had some people that killed a man who ran a service station kind of where near the old Father Ryan Hospital was on Elliston Place.
The high school.
Father Ryan High School on Elliston Place. There was a group of armed robbers that were serial armed robbers that we handled with. Now he was a young homicide detective, Paul Newman. Now he's a legendary sort of assistant DA down in Rutherford County.
Served a stint in the public defender's office.
Served a stint in the public defender's office.
Yes.
So,
I think you prosecuted a couple of teenagers who shot a police officer out.
Right. And I tried that case. I think I tried more cases second chair with General Shriver than any other assistant. I don't know, it just sort of worked out that way. But Charles Michael Gentry had killed an officer, George Hall, back in, I guess it was 76, 77, in that range. And And so I helped General Shriver try the case. Now, when you worked a case with General Shriver, you ended up doing the detail work. He was very effective. He was particularly effective in cross-examination.
Yes.
He mainly because you never knew what question he was going to ask next. It was rather than cross-examining somebody and going in some sort of logical order. He was particularly effective because they never knew what they were going to ask.
He would keep the defendant off balance
the whole time.
All right. I guess the SPU grant ran out of money in 1980 or 81, unfortunately.
And we couldn't. The city was not at that time. The city did not see that it should be spending money for what was a state function. The DA's office is a state office, and if the state wasn't providing enough money to hire additional assistant DAs, the city didn't see that it ought to either. And so they wouldn't pick up the grant. The grant expired. And I think all of us, one way or another, thought, well, this was maybe this was a sign. And rather than because what happened is that when we would go on the grant, they'd hire somebody, younger people, and we just thought, well, there's no sense in pushing them out of the office, and so that's when I went into private practice with Farris, Warfield, and at that time Farris, Warfield, and Kanaday for about 3.5 years.
Right, but before we leave that first stint in the DA's office, you were involved in the investigation, and not initially the investigation, I don't guess, but the prosecution of a young man, Jeffrey Womack, who was perhaps parenterally arrested in August of 1979 and charged with the murder of Marcia Trimble, the 9-year-old girl who was killed brutally in Green Hills back in 1975. And I know that's maybe not the most shining moment in DA's office history, but just for the record, how did you get involved in that prosecution, those proceedings? And tell us what you remember about how that developed.
I mean, initially, that was a very celebrated case, and it was a tragic case, and all of Nashville was focused on trying to find the perpetrator. And certainly a lot of suspicion had centered on Jeffrey Womack, who was a young teenage 16-year-old boy, I think, at the time, in the neighborhood. And certainly the police felt very strongly that he was the prime suspect. And I was not privy to any of these conversations, but I think General Shriver just felt there wasn't enough evidence. And so there was no arrest. And eventually another assistant, Pat Apel, approached General Shriver about taking another look at Marcia Trimble. Well, of course, a case of that high profile, that made perfectly good sense. So I think Pat even was almost on special assignment. I don't think I think he may have came out of court, didn't have a regular docket or whatever. And they put together a group of investigators from the police department who were likewise on special assignment. And I don't remember. It went on for a number of months of them re-examining the case. Eventually,
you at this time were not.
I had
you
nothing.
Were in the
I was in
unit, or
yeah. I was.
You were not asked to be on that team.
I was in SPU at the time. I had plenty to keep myself occupied, and was not asked to be involved in any way. Womack was arrested early morning hours. That's my recollection. General Shriver was out of town and wasn't aware of it. But in any event, the days that followed, Pat Apel was going around the office talking to different assistants because, as getting ready for the legal process that was to follow. And Pat came to see me and said, would you be interested in helping me try this case? And I asked him, give me a brief rundown of what the facts were, which he did, and I said, he wasn't asking me to sign on. He was just kind of, would I be interested? Was there something that would prevent me from doing it? I said, well, sounds like you've got a case that might, is a colorable case. I said, if we get to that point, I'll be happy to consider it or something. And that was really the extent of the conversation. And then sometime shortly after that, Pat left the office, and I can't remember precisely obviously he and General Shriver had a very serious disagreement over the way that case had been handled, at least as far as the arrest of Jeffrey
The
Womack.
timing of the arrest was maybe premature in General Shriver's view.
I think that's probably a fair statement. And so Pat leaves the office.
Here you
and
had
we still have
a pending
kid,
case at juvenile court, by the way, if I recall.
Correct.
Although Womack by this time was maybe 20 years old, under law, he had to be
commence or start there.
Proceedings had to begin with a transfer hearing at juvenile court because he was 15 at the time of the incident.
So one day I had been in court. I'd come down to the main office because the special prosecution unit was actually located on the third floor. And I'd just come down to the office to see, so I don't know, I was standing in the hallway talking to a couple of the assistants when I heard General Shriver come out of his office, and he walked down the hall and he looked at me. He said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Nothing. I just got out of court." And he said, "Well," he said, "John Hollins and Ed Yarborough want to take a deposition of, I believe, Marie Maxwell, who was one of the critical witnesses in the Marcia Trimble case." And he said, "Come on, we've got to go out to this lawyer's office and, I don't know, see what happens or something." So anyway, I said, "Okay." So he told me to come with him, and then as a result, I ended up being the assistant that was involved in that case. Although he took the lead to once Pat Apel left the office, General Shriver took the case on as his own.
And I believe that a transfer hearing was scheduled, and the defense subpoenaed 3 or 4 witnesses who ordinarily would be thought of as prosecution witnesses. I believe they may be subpoenaed and intended to call to the stand, maybe Sherman Nickens, Diane Vaughn, maybe medical examiner.
Right.
And General Shriver and you objected, claiming that they were just on a discovery expedition, and Judge Richard Jenkins, at that time our juvenile court judge, agreed with General Shriver and you and refused to let those witnesses testify.
Right.
But I guess Mr. Yarborough and Mr. Hollins appealed that to Circuit Court Judge Harry Lester, and he overturned Judge Jenkins, and then an appeal brief quickly was taken to the Court of Appeals, and they upheld Judge Lester, but then that remanded the matter back to Judge Jenkins for the transfer hearing.
And eventually we had a transfer hearing and put on, whatever witnesses we had at that point. They were cross-examined, so on and so forth. It was a pretty, contentious hearing. And then, but Judge Jenkins transferred him. But all that meant is that eventually then we would have to take the case to the grand jury.
And you eventually decided not to do that, General Shriver.
Well, we had to, at that point, at the transfer hearing, we didn't know much about the case because this was all something that Pat Apel had worked on, and from the very beginning it was assumed that Pat would be handling it and that would be knowledgeable about it and so forth. So at some point in this process, General Shriver and I said, well, we've just got to start investigating this thing. I mean, we've got to go through the 4 or 5 critical pieces of evidence, and some had to do with the timeline, another thing had to do with some statements, seemingly inculpatory statements that he had made to some students at Hillsborough High School, some analysis on some paint, some things like that. Some of these were sort of the key pieces of evidence. And so we started investigating all that, going back and re-interviewing people, and while the case was sitting, waiting for grand jury action. And of course, once it gets bound over, or in this case transferred, it really sits in the DA's office. And there's nothing, I mean, yes, you can hold it too long, but basically you as the district attorney or as the prosecutor have control over it. And so we held it there until we could continue to investigate it. And then I remember that we had and there was a lot of pressure. It was more pressure. I mean, I think it was much more pressure on General Shriver than it was on me about how Womack was the obvious suspect and he shouldn't get away with murder, and on and on and on. and I mean, but not only the news media, but certainly the police officials were all very much on the idea that we need to prosecute Womack, indict him, move on. And but General Shriver and I had become convinced that while we weren't here to say that Womack was not guilty, we didn't think we had nearly enough evidence to prove it. And maybe we had probable cause. Judge Jenkins sort of felt we had probable cause. But we didn't think we could prove it at trial. And he and
obviously the burden is beyond a
reasonable doubt. I mean, we knew that we didn't see any way that the proof would sustain that. And I think the other side of it was that let's assume that Jeffrey Womack was in fact the true culprit. If we tried it and he was acquitted, well, then he could never be tried again if something, not that we foresaw DNA, but I mean, but if something else, other proof came out, he couldn't be retried. And so General Shriver and I talked a long time about that, went late into the night, but we both kind of independently and together concluded that it just wasn't, we shouldn't go forward with it.
Of course, in the late 70s and early 80s, the technology and the science of DNA profiling was nowhere,
at
not
that
in
point
existence.
it was non-existent. I mean,
you had
it really was 1986 when
yes.
DNA was even used for the first time in a criminal case in the UK.
And the postscript to this, of course, is that around 2007 or 8, the cold case unit of the Metro Police Department and our office and the FBI were able to develop a DNA profile off the semen recovered from Marsha Trimble's body and match it to a person named Jerome Barrett, who never, as far as I know, was a suspect in the early days of the investigation. Turned out he had been serving a separate long prison sentence for another crime he had committed in Nashville in 1975 and was released, and under law had to give a DNA sample that eventually was matched up.
Well,
am I wrong about that?
I think what happened is that there were, you're right about the cold case unit, and I remember that there were 2 cases they were investigating. Of course, there was always the Jeffrey Womack, Marsha Trimble case, but then they'd started looking at this the Dupre case.
Yes,
and you'd have to get it specifically from Tom Thurman, but I remember, of course, Tom was my longtime deputy, and his primarily what Tom did, in addition to trying the major cases, was to work very closely with police on cases just like this that were being investigated and required kind of close supervision and a good working relationship with the police department. And Tom came in to see me one day and he said, well, you're not going to believe this. He said, but we just got a hit back on the DNA, and we don't know, it's my recollection, we don't know who it belongs to, but what we know is that whoever killed Sarah Dupre is the same one that killed Marsha Trimble. But at that point, we didn't know who that person was. We knew the DNA matched for both cases, and I think after that point, the police focused on the Dupre case. Now, the Dupre case had happened. Jerome Sidney Barrett became an obvious suspect at that point because he was a serial rapist that was working generally in the Belmont, Vanderbilt area. And there were actually several cases that they had made on him, but when he was convicted of the first case and got a very, very lengthy sentence,
30 years, I believe.
He wasn't retried on that. And the Dupre case, he was a suspect, a strong suspect, but it never, but just a few weeks later, Marsha Trimble was killed. And it seemed like the Dupre case was just sort of fell off the radar screen from that standpoint. So the cold case detectives were able to locate Barrett and found him in Memphis, went down there, and that's where they took a sample.
Okay.
And I mean, he voluntarily said, well, sure, I'll give you a DNA sample. And when they did, it matched. And so that not only tied him to the Dupre case, but to the Trimble case.
All right. And just to clarify the time, we're talking now the late 2007, 2008.
Something
so
along those lines.
27 years of
years later.
Hopes and leads and false leads have popped up from time to time.
And there were numerous efforts to reinvestigate the case. They took, once DNA became more readily used and available and so forth, the police went out and took DNA from practically everybody that lived in that neighborhood. And you're right but that didn't include Jerome Sidney Barrett, because he was a transient African American who, as best we could, there are several theories as to how he would have been in the neighborhood. There was a nursery that was really right across the street that used day laborers from time. There's also a theory that he may have been involved in looking for a woman that he had tried to attack and it escaped, and maybe he was trying to follow up on that. We don't know.
Very interesting case. And I know the historical committee of the bar that has put together a couple of CLE programs is going to do one on the Marcia Trimble case, and I believe you're on the committee.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about that.
About that
because it really did. I mean, there are people that refer to it as the case that where Nashville lost its innocence. I mean, it moved from sort of a small town to kind of a bigger city.
Yes. Anyway, back to your career. You left the DA's office in 1981 to go into private practice with the firm of
Farris, Warfield, and Kanaday at the time. Yep.
And you were primarily working on civil cases.
Civil litigation. I did some criminal defense. Work, not much, and did some appointed work in federal court, which was kind of interesting. But most of it was civil litigation. In 1984, an opportunity came to come back to the district attorney's office, and you did. Talk about how that developed. Well,
1984.
I had decided that after giving it what I felt was a considerable effort, I thought, this is just not what I want to do.
Not your thing.
This is not what I want to do, and I need a career change if this is it. So from that, I of course would see General Sharp from time to time, and I guess I came over and talked to him. I don't really remember, other than to say that he said, well, yeah, when I have an opening, I'll be happy to hire you back. And as I said, I had already been in the Farris Warfield for at least 3 years at that point, which I felt was a pretty reasonable amount of time. My recollection is David Rabin left the office to go into private practice himself, but to do criminal defense work, and so I came and rejoined the office and became went into Division II as the team.
And who was and is the judge in Division II?
At that time it was Judge Draper, and he was still on the bench. No, I'm sorry. I was in Judge Draper's court, but no, this was Judge Wyatt.
Judge Randall Wyatt.
That's right.
Who is still presiding over Division II.
Something else that occurred to me was that you were talking about when I was saying that David Rabin had gone into private practice and was doing defense work. It occurred to me that I decided that I didn't want to do criminal defense work, and the way that happened real quickly was that I'd gotten a call. I don't remember the year, but I got the call from Judge L. Clure Morton, who was the presiding federal district judge, and asked if I'd come down and talk to him. Well, I'd met him once probably, but I went down there, and he said, we're getting ready to establish a federal public defender's office, and we'd like, would you be interested? I don't know. I don't say. He said, would you be interested? Because I would be very interested in hiring you. You'd be the federal public defender. I hadn't done any federal defense work or anything like that, and so he said, and you'll have an office and you'll have a staff of, I don't know, very small staff, but a staff, and you'll get paid the same amount of money as the United States attorney. I thought, well, that sounds pretty good. And so I went back, I think that afternoon, to talk to General Schreiber about it. And we talked for, I don't know, an hour or so. And finally, and talked about a lot of different things, related to the office and practice law and so forth. And finally, Tom said, well, Torry, he says, to be honest with you, you really don't sound much like a defense lawyer. And I said, you're absolutely right. I said, it would be fun. I think I'd run in an office like that and starting something like that. But at the end of the day, I don't think that's really what I want to do. And so I called Judge Morton, or I went down to see him and said, I appreciate the consideration, but I just didn't think that was for me.
How funny the twists of her history turn out. So you were briefly, however briefly, considering becoming a
public
defense
defender.
attorney.
And I just, but I just remember him saying, he said, well, you just don't sound like you're going to be a defense lawyer. I said,
you came back to the district attorney's office in 1984. The office was only slightly bigger. And just to be clear, at that time, the physical office was in what we now call the historic courthouse.
Right.
It was on the first floor. The main lobby was on the first floor, and a number of the attorneys and staff were there. But your office,
and General Schreiber's
office that you inherited, was up the steps.
Up the steps.
And there was a hall down there leading into a library that was shared with the Metro Legal Department.
Such as it was, that's right.
A far cry from what we would have later at Washington Square. But talk about just the space issues there, the technology limitations.
Let's go back.
Maybe go back before
I can even
that.
go back to when I started, when I was a law student. I was the DA's office was up on the 6th floor.
Oh,
and it was in what was then, which later became, it later became part of the criminal court clerk's office, and then later became Judge Norman's Division 4 of criminal court. And it had a different kind of configuration because there was a half floor up there where the grand jury met, and anyway, it was very interesting.
I knew that once upon a time the district attorney's office was on the 6th floor, but I was somehow under the impression it had left there in the 50s or 60s.
It was
still
up
there.
there. That's when I started, and it moved downstairs in 70. Let's see, 2 or 3.
Okay.
And took on the space that you're describing, which I think someone told me was the old water department.
Okay. Again, we are talking about the courthouse, now referred to as the historic courthouse, and not to be confused with the Birch Building. Which
correct. And it was the west end of the building, and so it was. And I remember they had an open house. And I was not in the office. I was in law school. I was invited to come to the open house. Everybody's walking around. Well, I thought it was the biggest, most palatial place you'd ever seen. And I thought, well, there's no way we'll ever fill this office up. This will last us for. Well, it didn't last very long. Well, we had actually a conference room. There was a conference room in the DA's office, not what you're referring to, which was the library. And we thought, well, we got our own conference room. Well, it was immediately cannibalized. I mean, they got a couple of new positions, and they had no offices, and they put a wall through it.
Yes.
And then we went from 1972 until we eventually moved. For 20 years, we were in that space.
Yes.
And we grew and we grew and we grew, but with very small, very little extra space. We had to kind of keep cutting.
And barely enough room for lawyers, much less investigators, grand jury, support staff.
No place to meet with your victims and witnesses.
Hardly any place for one copying machine, much less the 3 or 4 we needed.
Correct.
I do remember there were these primitive word processors then that were considered a huge advance in technology over the manual typewriters that had been used for years. But anyway, you came back in '84, and about three and a half years later, you would be appointed the district attorney of Davidson County by Governor Ned McWhorter to fill the unexpired term of Tom Shriver. He had been reelected in 1982, defeating Steve North. He had been reelected in 82 for an 8-year term, but he did not finish that 8 years. Correct. Because he was appointed criminal court judge. And so before we talk about how that came about a little bit, and I know there was a lot of machinations. We don't need to go into those. But just
well, except to say that he had been, well, two things. One, he had Tom Shriver had been very active in Ned McWhorter's campaign for governor, and so he was certainly someone that the governor thought highly of, and so on and so forth. Well, we had a situation in criminal court where we had a judge, Judge Gray, who was the subject of a TBI investigation regarding taking money in cases and so on and so forth. And Governor McWhorter, Judge Gray resigned, and Governor McWhorter approached General Shriver and said, look, I think it's really important that you I need to appoint someone in this position with unquestioned integrity, given what's gone on, and I think you're the person for it, and I'd like you to do that. And so he did. As part of that, he then in turn appointed me to take Tom's position, and you had Tom Shriver's position, and at that point you had to run, the way the appointment was, you had to run at the next biennial election, which really meant it was coming up. So I had a very short time, which was good because everybody else had a short time. So I was, and I had Governor McWhorter's kind of endorsement, and I had to go see Sheriff Fate Thomas, who was also a political power broker at the time, and so nobody ran against me. And
1988.
That was 88 to 90, and then 90 was the first full term.
You were elected to a full 8-year term in 1990. Back real quickly, during the 3 or 4 years you were an assistant under Tom Shriver the second time around, did you gain any additional experience during that time, or have you?
We were trying.
I remember a case you tried against the pharmacist who shot his son.
Oh well, that was one.
Am I remembering that right?
General Shriver and I tried that case. That was
a headline case.
Yeah, it was a headline
case
of a case that the pharmacist, Mr. Jones, had his grandson. I don't think there was much question that his grandson had been severely injured. He was a toddler, severely injured by Mr. Jones's daughter's live-in boyfriend.
Oh, they weren't married.
They weren't married, is my recollection. He was not the father of the child, is also my recollection. And so the child was brought to Vanderbilt Hospital by this person. Child was, as I say, in a coma, I think, practically at that time. And the family spent several nights, spent several days, 24-hour days, kind of at the hospital. That was the mother, the boyfriend, the grandfather, the grandmother, and assorted other people. And the grandfather eventually, but the police were investigating, but they had not made an arrest. So he was the prime suspect, but he was all part of the family right there. And the grandfather, Mr. Jones, the pharmacist, went home, lived up in Sumner County or Hendersonville, and I believe, and he got a gun, loaded it, took a drink or two, as he said, to steady his nerves, came back to Nashville, drove all the way back, went into the Vanderbilt Hospital carrying a gun long before there was any rudimentary security, and went into the family waiting room, and everybody was sound asleep, including the boyfriend. And he shot the boyfriend 3 or 4 times, killed him right there. Then waited for the police, handed him the gun, And the news media and the public sentiment was completely that it was that he ought to be given a medal, and that we can't.
Even
we're
though
wasting our time to prosecute him.
Very obvious he premeditated.
Oh, yeah,
he intended all along.
And so we ended up. But again, General Shriver took the position that you couldn't take the law into your own hands, and so the grand jury indicted him. I don't know if they indicted him for first degree or second degree. I know that when we tried it, so then we had a jury, and nobody really thought we'd get any kind of conviction, but he was convicted. Now I'm trying to think of either involuntary or voluntary manslaughter. Got virtually no sentence, but that wasn't really the point.
But you got a conviction of any kind.
And the jury came back, and they, no one thought he necessarily needed to do hard time at the state penitentiary, but it was the idea that you just couldn't take the law in your own hands like that.
All right. 1988, you're elected to fill out the unexpired term of General Shriver, and then in 1990, you were elected again to serve your first of 3 8-year terms as
Correct.
district attorney. And at that time, I believe the district attorney's office was operating under a contract with the Department of Human Services to enforce the federal law requiring states to collect child support from non-custodial parents of children who received aid to families with dependent children. I believe that the district attorney's office in Nashville and maybe some other DA's offices around the state had that contract. And did you find it was just unenforceable, that the demand for those services exceeded the resources your office could provide?
This is something I don't know. I think General Shriver took the first contract to do this, and from day one, the number of cases totally overwhelmed what staff we had. And we had 25 or 30 people that were working in child support,
including 3 or 4 lawyers.
Including 3 or 4 lawyers, and of course, prior to me becoming DA, I knew we did child support, but it wasn't anything I did. I was totally unfamiliar with it. And I really looked at it long and hard, trying to figure out what we could do to improve it and provide the best services and so forth. But got virtually no support from the state. I mean, they would, and there had been they had gotten a consultant. The state had, is my recollection, before I was DA. And the consultant came in and said, well, you need 90 people, not 90 people. We had like 35. And so I asked the state coordinator, or the person that was running, I said, well, what about this? What are we going to do about that? Aren't we going to try to get some of these people? No. I mean, no, and there's no budget for it, and too bad.
And I think legal services filed some lawsuits.
Eventually, legal services filed a lawsuit because people weren't getting the service they need, which was all true. I mean, but I could see that the state wasn't going to provide the resources, and so I gave the state notice that I was not going to renew the contract. They asked me to stay for a year so they could kind of plan for it, and eventually it went to a private contractor.
Yeah.
As far as I know, I think they've done a fine job as far as I know, although it's gone through a couple of contractors, and I'm not exactly sure how they got compensated or what, but I do think they were able to provide more technology and more people to actually do the job.
And relieved of the burden was a tremendous lift off your and the office's shoulders.
It was something that was not it was strictly contractual. It had nothing to do with our constitutional duty, the DA, to prosecute criminal cases. And so, and yet it was there were a lot, thousands and thousands of cases. And so, it took time that I felt could be better used elsewhere.
And another way you more efficiently deployed what resources you had, and bear in mind, if I'm not mistaken, Metro government, unlike maybe now, was not a major funder of the office's
Correct.
Budget.
Right.
And so you had a limited budget, I guess, exclusively from state sources.
The only thing Metro, traditionally the big four, Shelby, Davidson, Knox, and Hamilton. Those four, the tradition was that it was that the cities in those jurisdictions were to provide the operating budget of the office space and things like that, but not personnel. Just they were to provide office space and postage and paper and things like that. So we got a little bit there, but no personnel costs at that time.
In other words, the funding for attorneys' salaries and
all came from the state.
You were able to make a little bit go a long way. I know one thing you did was to kind of specialize prosecution units to specialize in specific areas, right. Domestic violence being one, child physical and child sex abuse, DUI, fraud and white collar crime.
White collar crime, major drug investigation.
Would you say that gave you an advantage over the way things were run before?
Oh, I think I learned that lesson in the special prosecution unit to see how much more efficiently and better I thought you could handle cases. One, if you developed a certain expertise, but also we worked hard to put a system together where we had much more vertical representation than the traditional horizontal representation.
So vertical, you mean but getting involved in prosecuting the case at the preliminary hearing level in general sessions
and handling the case at the grand jury,
yes.
and then picking up the case again when it got to criminal court, so that there was much more of every assistant was more responsible for the case they had. And if they would indict it, they would investigate it, they would try it, and so they just were more invested in it.
At the days where you would be told, hey, you need to go down to Judge Cornelius's court, he's not trying anything, can you try this burglary trial? And you're given the file and say, put the witnesses on the stand. Well, I don't know what they saw.
Right.
You put them on and
so
ask them, what do you know about this?
Why are you
Those days were in the past.
I mean, that's right. And so, because I think we had seen that there was understand, the defense bar had become more sophisticated. The law was changing rapidly. I mean, understand, when I started, this was before we had the Tennessee Rules of Evidence, before we had the rules of criminal procedure. I mean, it was all almost common law that we were using. And then, of course, later in 1989, there was the rewrite of the substantive law. There was the change in the sentencing procedure. I mean, so there were massive changes, and we had to change with it to be able to deal with that. I believe one thing I noticed in the 80s, and you certainly would have noticed, greater attention to victims and families of victims. Right. Previously, you were a lawyer, you built the case, you figured out which witnesses you needed to call and what they were testified to, and you didn't necessarily have time to deal with the emotions being generated by the crime toward the victims and their families. And a victim witness program, I believe developed first by General Shriver, was greatly enhanced when you came in. Well, I mean, and that was what did they
talk
a little
about? What they did?
At that time, prosecutors really thought that they didn't technically represent the victim, right. And the victims typically got very short shrift a lot of times from prosecutors. We're going to do what we want to do. We don't really care what you think about it. And so that wasn't universal, but I mean, that was kind of the sense that victims were kind of a nuisance in some ways. And so General Shriver had gotten a grant, and that grant really was more just getting victims to court. At that time, the victims were called on the telephone, often by sheriff's deputies, given cursory information about be in court or else kind of thing, and maybe they showed up and maybe they didn't. And so the original program was to use mostly volunteers to call people and follow up on what the sheriffs had called and tell them. And so when the people had questions like, well, I don't even know where this is, the volunteers could try to help them get to court. That made a huge difference. Well, eventually, it changed to where we were now not only just getting people to court, but we were also getting people who had often social work backgrounds, who wanted to work with folks and deal with all the other issues that came, particularly in the areas of violent crime. So that you get them into counseling, hold their hands during courts, and it provides some emotional support that had never been provided before.
And you had an excellent series of directors, Jody Folk and her staff, and then later Teresa
Sharon. Both were dedicated professionals who and developed staffs of that equally professional.
Yes. I believe by the early 90s we were in a severe space shortage in the courthouse, but we didn't necessarily have sources of, obviously we're getting money from Metro by then, we're getting money from the state, but they were not able to provide a huge space for us. And talk about how we were able to find funding to move out of the courthouse to the Washington Square.
Is that I knew we had a new mayor in Mary Bers, and one, he was a businessman, which I thought helped a little bit. But I knew that they were looking for space to expand some of the more city hall functions in the courthouse, and we had a fair amount of space, and I had gotten a Metro or somebody on the Metro contract under a Metro contract to come in and look at our space utilization. And while we could certainly make better use of it, at the end we were still going to be we still were landlocked. We didn't have any space for expansion. We'd have better space, but no expansion space, which didn't seem to make a lot of sense. So I went to the mayor and said, look, I've got something that you would like, space in the courthouse. I'm happy to move out, but only if I can get truly adequate space someplace else. He said, and I'm going to need help. I can't do it financially because we would be going out in the private marketplace, and that would mean that we would have to be paying market rate for rent, so on and so forth. And he said that made sense to him. We had to talk about it a little bit, but he was very quick to do that. So we went out, we looked at 2 or 3 buildings that were in very close proximity, eventually settled on Washington Square, which was had been totally renovated, but had really 2 complete floors that were empty. And so we took over the 5th floor. We got with the building and with the lease came a space planner, and so we were able to design an office that had multiple conference rooms, good offices for lawyers, cubicles for the support staff, and so forth. And
5 conference rooms. Separate break rooms.
This was
like several orders of magnitude of improvement over.
This is the Taj Mahal.
Yes, it was.
And to your point, we at the same time, early on when I became DA, we started looking at allegations of particularly illegal gambling, and perhaps illegal gambling being somewhat protected by the police department. And so we did we did quite a few raids in conjunction with our own investigators and with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and the criminal division of the Internal Revenue Service. And over that, we generated, we seized lots of assets. And it was at a time, I didn't even know about it at the time, that I think the IRS maybe told me. They said, well, these assets that you've seized, they can come back to the DA's office. They can help you. Really. So I went to, at that time, Attorney General Thornburg came to Nashville, and he had a couple of things. One of the reasons he came to Nashville was to give me a presentation check of $450,000 or something like that. That was part of this money that we had seized and had been forfeited to our office. And I went to Washington to talk about it. I said, look, here's what we need. I mean, here's what, can we spend this money on things like office furniture and computers and stuff like that? And the person who ran the program in DC said, well, yeah, sure, you can do that. I mean, because up to that point, this money usually went to police departments to buy body armor or guns or whatever. And they said, no, you can use it for that. And so that's when we came back and we were able to really outfit the office, both with a computer system and the furniture and so forth from that money.
And if I recall, that check was close to $500,000, which is a
tremendous amount
windfall.
Tremendous windfall.
Not to imply that it was luck. There was a lot of work.
But I mean, we didn't. I mean, we started the process going. In doing the investigation only later to learn that money that we seized, because we were seizing assets, we were seizing cash. They had been operating in a wide open fashion, and
the gamblers in markets
and so I felt when we started the investigation, we really caught them. They were surprised. They didn't think, and then they didn't think it would last, and we kept at it and kept at it and kept at it.
Yes, and credit must be given up. John Zimmerman in our office spearheaded
it and
those investigations.
Absolutely.
So by, I believe, December of 1993, we had this wonderful space in the Washington Square building, which, just for the record, was the old Washington Manufacturing Company where blue jeans had been made years before on 2nd Avenue North in downtown Nashville. And it remains the home of the district attorney's office. You served as district attorney for almost 26 years, from December 1st, 1987 to August of 2014, end of August 2014. I know your style may be different from General Shriver, who would from time to time get in the courtroom and try a big case, and you for the most part stayed out of the courtroom and left it up to your assistants, except, if I'm not mistaken, you did get in the courtroom on the Maddox Foundation investigation a little bit.
I was really more the client than anything else.
Yeah, but you actually argued that, if I recall correctly, didn't you?
Well, I mean, I'm trying to think. There may have been a little bit. I might have been, but really, it was really more the lawyers that we had from Waller Lanston. But I mean, things had changed at that point, and I felt that I remember I went to a training program when I became DA, and there was a DA there who was the district attorney at that time in Chicago, and he said, he made the point. He said, the DA going to court trying a case is like the police chief making arrests. And I think that's true in an urban area. I mean, clearly in a rural area, the police chief probably makes arrests and the DA has to try the big cases. Right. But I realized that when we had ended up with 6 courts, all of this, sure, I could try some cases, but I couldn't make a significant dent. And having dealt with having tried those cases with General Shriver, I knew that what I really would be doing is be putting a burden on an assistant who would have to do the bulk of the work. And I didn't think that was productive under those circumstances.
Talking about the Maddox case, if I'm not mistaken, Dan Maddox, a wealthy Nashville businessman, and his wife were killed in a boating accident in the 1990s.
Correct.
They had established a foundation to give to many worthy causes and charitable organizations, and management of it somehow came in the hands of someone who moved it to Mississippi and was maybe paying herself an exorbitant salary and or spending foundation money on things like sports teams or other, not necessarily causes you thought the Maddox family would endorse. And how was you eventually, with the assistance of, I guess, some other attorneys, were able to get the court to order management of the foundation back into responsible hands.
Well, and I mean, we sued them, and I mean that's your summary is essentially correct. And I wasn't aware. I mean, I was vaguely aware of the Maddox Foundation and vaguely aware that it moved to Mississippi, but really didn't know much else about it. And a relative of the family, of the Maddox family, came to me and described what was going on, and we started looking at it. And I had just been to a little conversation with a lawyer friend of mine who was talking about what foundations could and couldn't do, and it sounded to me like what they were doing, at least allegedly doing, didn't really fit what foundations were supposed to do. And so we looked at it and had a lengthy lawsuit, went up to the Court of Civil Appeals here on a very technical legal issue, which we prevailed. It got to be a tug of war between the state of Tennessee and the state of Mississippi because this was a large foundation. My recollection, it was $50+ million back then. And
we're talking the late 90s.
This would have been, late 90s,
2000s.
early 2000. And so we eventually, the litigation went on for 2+ years. Eventually, we were able to get, I think, a very good settlement. I mean, where they kept about half the assets, we kept half the assets, or we got half the assets. We being a new foundation, the Dan and Margaret Maddox Foundation, I think it is here. It's totally separate management, and over the years since then, it's given literally millions and millions of dollars to charities, primarily in Nashville, but also in Middle Tennessee, and on some identified areas that Dan and Margaret Maddox were interested in.
Well, speaking of charitable organizations, you personally have served on the boards and been very actively involved in several here in Nashville, especially ones that tie into what the district attorney does. I'm thinking of the Nashville Child Advocacy Center. I think it's called the Nashville Children's Alliance.
Right.
Maybe the YWCA and some.
Been on an advisory board with the YWCA off and on because of what they did with the domestic violence in the shelter, and currently I'm and have been for quite a while on the board of Cumberland Heights because you certainly see the effects of substance abuse, which is so prevalent in the criminal justice system.
Yeah. Have you gotten a lot out of serving on those boards?
Yeah, certainly the Children's Alliance. I mean, we started that years and years ago, and it's been a tremendous help for young children who are forced to go through the criminal justice system.
Well, it caught some of us by surprise in January of 2014 when you announced you were not going to seek re-election, and you exited very gracefully and turned to a new career, a little bit of a change of career, but not totally. Tell us what you've been doing for the last 3 years or so.
Well, so I've been teaching over at Belmont in law school, teaching criminal law, all things criminal law, and it's been a great transition. One of the things I enjoyed about the district attorney's office is that we had such a broad kind of cross-section of lawyers, people like yourself and others who'd been around for many, many, many years, but also young lawyers, just getting started in the practice. And I like being around the younger people. But I'd gotten to the point where I felt, yes, I could continue to do it, but I was just afraid that I didn't want to kind of lose that edge. And I was a little bit tired of dealing with the legislature and dealing with budgets and some of those kinds of less than glamorous things that just come with the territory.
Yes. Well, the current district attorney, Glenn Funk, actually worked under you at one time years ago.
He was hired by General Shriver.
He was hired by General Shriver in 1986.
Right.
And probably you didn't envision him one day being district attorney, but he's
That's right.
worked his way hard up.
Works his way up or whatever. That's right.
You're just briefly, your personal life, you're married long time to Mary Layden, and y'all have had three
We
wonderful
got
children.
three daughters. Right now, only one of them's married, and the middle one, no grandchildren, no nothing else. But
And one of them, if I'm not mistaken, went to law school.
one of them went to law school
Caroline.
in Caroline, and she worked a little bit for Judge Steve Dozier here
Yes.
as a kind of law clerk sort of position, and then she got an opportunity to go and work at Vanderbilt at the law school in the admissions department.
Is that where she's currently?
And that's where she
employed?
currently is, and she went to Vanderbilt undergrad, and I don't know what her plans are, but I think she's very happy to be in the Vanderbilt family. And then I've got my youngest daughter is a social worker at Vanderbilt at the Children's Hospital. So we've got two that are working at Vanderbilt.
Well, that's fantastic. So you are at least your daughter that's got the law degree is at least the third generation.
Third generation.
Johnson.
I don't know if she'll ever really practice law or
Yeah.
not. I mean, we'll see.
Well, it's a tremendous profession, and you have added to it in countless in intangible and tangible ways in our city for many, many years, and we thank you for your service. Is there anything else you wish I had asked and that you would like to tell us?
I think, listen, we could still be here talking about
Yes, we
individual
could.
cases or
Yes.
things that, there were cases, that caught the public attention, Marcia Trumbull we've talked about, Perry March, I mean, just lots of those things. But to me, the only thing I'll say is that it was a great honor to be district attorney and to be able to try to create an office with well-meaning people to go out there and work on behalf of the public and represent people who never asked to be in the criminal justice system. They were victims of crime. Something bad happened to them, and most of them were lost and confused and they needed people to be their advocate, and it didn't matter their station in life or anything else. And I think we tried to make sure that everybody hopefully got the representation that they deserved. Now, sometimes they didn't always appreciate it, but I mean, the idea is that we handled things hopefully in an even-handed way to make what was, we think, the most just result under the circumstances and given the evidence that we had.
Well, you certainly accomplished those goals, for which you should be very proud. And Torry, thank you so much.
Sure, Paul, thank you. Appreciate it.